Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be talking in just a minute with David French. But let me welcome another station to the lineup. As you might remember, on Monday, we actually added the station from Daytona Beach, WMFJ, 1450 AM. Today, we add another station to the lineup, and that is from Las Vegas, Nevada, KKVV, 1060 AM. So if you're listening to this for the very first time, certainly want to welcome you to the broadcast, and certainly want to thank the number of radio stations that are adding on to this particular lineup here at Point of View. I don't know, maybe they knew that David French is going to be on today, but we're picking up a number of stations just even this week. So very encouraging indeed, and so I want to welcome you to the broadcast. David French is with us. He is senior editor of The Dispatch and also a columnist for Time. We have certainly posted many of his columns over the years when he was a senior writer with National Review, and you might remember last time we had him on to talk about his book, Divided We Fall, America's Succession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. I have taken the time to post some of his material from a piece that came out a month ago, When Everyone is Right, That Everyone is Wrong. And if you would like to know a little bit more about some of the other things he's doing, we may not get into some of the other things he's written about, but I might mention our good friends at Ministry Watch just did a podcast with him on some of the scandals in the evangelical world. So, David French, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thanks so much for having me back. I appreciate it.
Let's see if we can get into this, because the title is When Everyone is Right, That Everyone is Wrong, or Yet Another Reason Why a Third Party Might Save American Politics. Now, if I can remember back from our interview last time, we talked about, of course, your book, Divided We Fall. And you pointed out the fact that, of course, we all know that America is quite polarized, but you sort of gave us some reasons for that. One is just geography, because more and more people are living in what are called landslide countries or counties. That's where a presidential candidate wins by more than 20 counties, 20 points or something of that nature. And then, of course, just the whole idea of negative polarization. So I guess we start with the idea that we've always had polarized politics, but it seems to be getting worse. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely fair. Absolutely fair. What's happened is that we have politics has been increasingly dominated by a relatively small percentage of Americans. What a group called More in Common, which has done serious research on American polarization, has identified as the wings of American politics. It's really less than 20% of Americans. They account for an incredibly disproportionate amount of our political intensity. And those wings hate each other with a remarkable degree of intensity. And so we have this dynamic where a relatively small minority of Americans are driving a very large amount of our polarization. And that doesn't mean that the rest of the country isn't polarized. It just means that the rest of the country is less committed to its polarization than the wings that are doing most of the political, who are engaging in most of the political discourse in the United States.
And one of the things that we've talked about on this program before is what's called the hidden tribes of America, which I think is the same idea. And that is that you have on one side the very progressive activists, on the other side the very reactionary conservatives. They only account for a small percentage of Americans, but they're the ones that show up on one side on Fox News, on the other side MSNBC. They're the ones that are the most vocal. And in the past, I think you've even said in one of your commentaries that we sometimes depend upon those people that are more engaged to educate us, but it turns out that those who are more engaged are the most polarized and most biased of all. Is that fair again?
Yeah, they're the most wrong about their political opponents. That's what is particularly distressing, or one of the many distressing things, is that the people who consume the most political media are the most wrong about their political opponents. They think they're more extreme than they really are, or that they're more hateful than they really are. And so what ends up happening is the more that you consume, the more radicalized you often become, and you're radicalized into error by error because you're incorrect in your assessment of your opponents. And the interesting thing is those people who don't spend much time on political media, they tend to have the most accurate view of their political opponents because they get their view of their political opponents from these things called friendships or relationships rather than tweets or Facebook posts.
And again, some people have referred to that as this exhausted majority. And, they're fed up and they're forgotten and all the rest. And so as a result, and I used to use this illustration. Matter of fact, later on, we're going to talk about, of course, the oral arguments before the Supreme Court on abortion. But years ago, when we oftentimes would talk to pro-life people, I would say, you've got to understand that if you're making your pro-life case, don't react to people with NARAL or Planned Parenthood as much as you would certainly want to do that, because the reality is that it's almost like if I can put on a spectrum or on a ruler, on one side you have the Planned Parenthood, NARAL, on the other side you have, Operation Rescue, whatever you want to put, Rescue, or some of their very activist individuals, and it's like one shoots a missile all the way over the middle to hit the other side, and then the other one shoots a missile over the other side, and there are people in the middle just watching these missiles go back and forth, and you run into, and I'm sure you have as well, people that have said, I guess if I were to be honest, I'd call myself pro-life, but I just, have some real hesitations about some of the things that people who call themselves pro-life say about abortion. They call them abortion mills, they call them baby killers and all the rest. Or I've run into some people that say, I kind of believe in choice, but my goodness, I can't believe how some of these people that I know that work with Planned Parenthood just vilify and say this is just an attempt of establishing a theocracy in America. And so most of the people in the middle they can't relate to either side. Is that fair?
Yeah. And, an interesting thing about this exhausted majority isn't necessarily that it is all people in the middle. It's the people on the right and on the left who are tired of this. And so I think of it like this. So you have people who have an ideology. In other words, they have a set of political positions or a political philosophy. But they also have a temperament, and that temperament might be angry, or it might be more reasonable, or it might be more mild. And so what you're beginning to see happen is that there are people who have maybe a pretty set ideology, but a pretty mild temperament. In other words, look, I believe I'm strongly pro-life, but I also think that there are people on the pro-choice side who arrive at their positions in good faith and goodwill, and I'm going to try to persuade them that they're wrong. I'm not going to vilify them. And that's kind of the dynamic you just described. And so what's ending up happening is more of these people who have a more sort of milder or more reasonable or more conciliatory temperament are being driven out of our political discourse, just being chased out of it, because that very reasonableness is being perceived as not as compassion, not as openness, but as weakness. And so that they're being driven out of the public square.
I want to talk about that, and of course, even what about the idea of a third party? It's a question I get all the time, and David French has addressed it. We'll come back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Gas prices are rising and Americans want action. What can a president do? Well, President Biden has the answer. Instruct the Federal Trade Commission to investigate the actions of the oil industry. The president alleges that gasoline producers are ripping off American consumers and claims that there is mounting evidence of anti-consumer behavior by oil and gas companies. That's a very dramatic claim. Where's the establishment media? Remember this phraseology? President Trump stated, without evidence. At the very least, can't we get at least one media outlet to say something like President Biden said today, without evidence, that oil companies are engaged in illegal activities? There isn't any evidence of this, but that doesn't seem to matter. Energy prices are facing upward pressure for several economic reasons. Some of them have to do with the previous pandemic lockdowns. Others have to do with policies put in place by the president. The economics are simple. Energy demand is outpacing supply. The demand for gas plummeted in the spring of 2020 during the lockdowns. The price of oil took a precipitous nosedive. Once the economy reopened, demand increased. But you can't turn everything around in just a few months. Supply is still not caught up with demand. The most concerning part of this is that President Biden is unleashing federal police powers on energy companies. If previous presidents misused their presidential power in this way, I suspect that such a demand would be greeted by more than a collective yawn from the media and most political pundits. Blaming oil companies is a political distraction that focuses attention away from economic forces that need to be explained and government policies that need to be changed. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with David French as we talk about his piece, which I might mention is from the Dispatch. We gave you a copy of parts of it. And if you are not already subscribed to the Dispatch, let me encourage you to do so. As you go there, you'll see an opportunity to put in your email, and I would encourage you to subscribe to it. I do, so I'm not asking you to do anything that I don't do, and it's certainly something that we end up talking about so often, even when David French is not on the program with us. When everyone is right, that everyone is wrong, or yet another reason why the third party might save American politics. Before we talk about this idea of a third party, let's come back to that comment you made just before we went to the break, and that is people that want to have a rational civil discussion or want to maybe try to make a reasoned case for their view find themselves oftentimes pushed out of the discussion because the loudest voices get the attention. And it's not just on cable news. Of course, that's an easy whipping boy. But even more recently, I was going to different precinct meetings because I, for a while, was a precinct chairman. Oh, yeah, like I needed one more thing to do. But I was later talking to someone who left as a precinct chairman because she just simply said, I was just getting so tired of the rancor that would take place in these meetings because oftentimes you would have most of the people saying, let's move on. But there's always at least one or two rabble-rousers that would be in there and kind of ratchet up the rhetoric.
Well, right. I mean, and that is just growing exhausting to people, just absolutely exhausting. So, for example, talk to pastors. Pastors will tell you that it really is a relatively small percentage of any given congregation that is disgruntled but the intensity of their anger has really ramped up over the last few years. And in some cases, sort of the percentage of people who are angry has ramped up a little bit, but they're still a minority. But the relentlessness of it, often the anger of it, sometimes the cruelty of it, it is completely exhausting to people. And so what ends up happening is that folks who don't sort of put politics at the absolute center of their lives are beginning to withdraw. Doesn't mean that they don't vote. Maybe they don't vote in the primaries as much, but they still vote. But on that day-to-day discourse, that day-to-day conversation, they're starting to withdraw, because if they stick their toe in the water, and unless they agree with the angriest voices, even if those, are maybe members of their family or people they've known for years, it's kind of like getting shocked with an online cattle prod. We're just not built to be attacked like that. And so it's causing a lot of good people to step away, and it's leaving a lot of the day-to-day work of politics and political commentary and to those folks who are the angriest and the loudest voices and the most inured against any kind of criticism.
Well, now, think for just a minute. Again, you're talking about just the fact that they would want to withdraw from politics, but even withdraw from making a comment. And I'm thinking back to, now this goes back to October, in which you told this incredible story, which illustrates something I've run into when I've spoken on college campuses, when you were helping those who were at a university to try to make the case that obviously if we have a Christian group on this campus, we would want Christians to be in the leadership. And you worked with this woman by the name of Tish Harrison Warren, who is about as different as you could be. I mean, you were very conservative. You've been in the military. She was more what you might call kind of more of the progressive evangelical. But she found herself very quickly when she was trying to say, well, okay, I don't want to bring David French there because, that might be a problem. Because after all, they kind of see him coming at Vanderbilt. But instead, she comes in here thinking, certainly, I'm not like one of those Liberty University types. I'm not like somebody even goes to Wheaton, and yet she finds very quickly that she's being battered because she was just simply saying, wait a minute, we're moderates, we're like you. And I think it's an illustration that even now we see this whole philosophy that you just can't be liberal enough without the cancel culture coming after you. And in that case, it was a group that didn't get to be on campus. But for some people, it's, I'm going to lose my job if I just even say that I believe that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, or I believe that marriage should be between a man and a woman, or something of that nature. I can actually suffer greatly for any kind of statement as simple as that.
Well, we're increasingly reaching a point where the people who are most politically active, where there's no such thing as sort of being 80% on their side or 90% on their side.
Yes.
You're 100% with them, or you're 100% bad. And we see this emerging. There's cancel culture on the left side. We've seen this where there's been cancel culture on the right, where you're all in, or you're all out. And this is a phenomenon that's directly tied to everything that we're talking about. Because if you do despise your political opponents that intensely, and if you do believe that your political opponents are a direct and mortal threat to the Republic of the United States of America, then if somebody has maybe even kindness towards your opponents, or maybe listens to their argument about this issue or that issue, well, again, that's all viewed as weakness. That's all viewed as compromise, and it is the kind of thing that then leads to fury and anger and almost a sense of betrayal. So in that story, Tish, my friend, she never had a chance. She thought that, because she was progressive in so many areas, that would have bought her some goodwill. And sadly, in that circumstance, it didn't buy goodwill. And so, this was a story she wrote in Christianity Today several years ago called The Wrong Kind of Christian.
Yes.
And really, it was a viral, powerful article. But yeah, it's interesting, though, because she is now often despised on the right because she's not all in on the right. And so all of the goodwill she earned standing up to Vanderbilt several years ago, well, she doesn't like Donald Trump, so she loses that goodwill on the right. And that's where we are, is sort of this, you're with me on everything, or I don't want you, you can't be a part of the community. And again, this is not a majority view. This is not where most people are.
No.
But it is certainly where many people are, and that many is disproportionately concentrated in politics.
And, of course, in Twitter and other things. We've had Jonathan Haidt on talking about the coddling of the American mind, that it isn't just that you're wrong, but that you're evil. And I think that caught a lot of people off guard. I mean, J.K. Rowling, Barry Weiss, Jonathan Turley, even lately I've been quoting Bill Maher, David Chappelle. I mean, these are people that had no idea that all of a sudden their statement, which in some cases was just basic biology or basic facts or some statement about anti-Semitism or transgenderism, whatever it might be, that would get them canceled. And of course, what you see, David, is that I'm running into more and more people that are just sort of saying, you know what, I'm just going to keep my head down, because you know what, it doesn't pay to even speak out. And so the voices we need to hear the most from are the ones that are very easily silenced. And of course, that's the premise of your article. So just before we take a break, let's see if we can talk about the fact that what would be an advantage. I know there are a million hurdles to a third party, but one of the things that I've always said is that when you have sort of a majority, if you're a Democrat, and maybe you're just a fairly conservative Democrat, and you're saying, I really don't really like some of the things of AOC, what she's saying. I don't really like some of the socialism. I think some of the environmentalism is too radical. They say, well, where are you going to go? Or maybe you're a conservative, but you're saying, I'm not sure I like everything that I see in the Republican Party. I'm not sure I like having Marjorie Taylor Greene as a representation of that. And I don't really like some of the things Trump said. And they say, well, where are you going to go? The advantage of a multi-party system, and I've seen this in Israel and Italy, is it at least eliminates some of that, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It sort of it eliminates this binary choice argument where you can be deeply, deeply dissatisfied with a nominee, and then you're browbeaten in voting for them because, well, you surely aren't going to vote for the other side, are you? And so you're eliminating that binary choice, and that's really, really important, because the way things have gone now, most seats, whether held by Republicans or Democrats, are safe seats. And so that means the primary is really the only vote that matters, and primary voters tend to be disproportionately concentrated amongst the more the community of people who are the most engaged and most polarized. And I saw a statistic at a presentation a week or two ago that 10% of America actually ends up electing 83% of our Congress.
Isn't that amazing?
Those are the primary voters in these safe seats, and they're the ones who end up disproportionately powerful. In a multi-party democracy would change that.
Let's take a break. We have a lot more to talk about. What about this idea of a third party? We're going to talk about that with David French, and then we'll get some comments about the oral arguments today before the Supreme Court on abortion. We'll be right back.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue conversation today with David French. Let me just mention that, again, we have information about the Dispatch, and this may be something you would want to subscribe to. And if you find what we've posted today on the fourth page, a very good discussion of what that third party, if we want to talk about it, would look like. And, David, we're really talking about two ideas. One comes from another individual that you and I respect, Jonah Goldberg, who was talking about a third party in terms of maybe like a conservative party. But then you put together this idea of a party that's maybe more ideologically heterodox. And I'll be the first to admit that almost all of the state constitutions and requirements make it really hard for third parties. But nevertheless, we've had a Libertarian Party, a Green Party, a Communist Party, and others. But if there was such a party, you've got, I think, a very interesting idea of why that party would be able to not only help us avoid the binary choice, but might actually have a positive impact on the existing parties. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so essentially what you're talking about are the existing parties are increasingly captured by their very polarized wings, which means that you have a lot of people all across the spectrum who are kind of exhausted by the parties that they've traditionally supported. And so the idea is essentially to recreate a dynamic that we used to actually have in our two parties, which was that you have ideologically heterodox coalitions within the same party. In other words, so if you have a third party and that third party is in the South and that third party is running a candidate in the South, that candidate's going to be more conservative. If they're running a candidate in the Northeast, that candidate is going to be more moderate. And so essentially what you're doing is you're providing a check on that binary choice. And you're also doing something else. You're providing a reboot, a fresh start, in the same way that when a new media company like the Dispatch starts and it says, hey, we want to do this better than previous media companies have. Or when you're an entrepreneur and you start a new company, you say, we're going to have a corporate culture that's just better than other corporate cultures. This is a very American thing. It's that reboot. It's that fresh start. And one of the things that I argue is that a reboot and a fresh start, and again, there's a lot of barriers to it, as we know, but a reboot and a fresh start that gives people a home where they don't have to feel like I have to be in alliance with extremists to win elections, or I don't have to be in alliance with extremists to compete fairly in American democracy, I think is one that could be very, very healthy. It's interesting, when America was less polarized, our parties were more heterodox. It's fascinating, but when you go back and you look at the Reagan era, for example, even though the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives, all 8 years of Reagan's presidency, there were many years where Reagan had a working majority in the House. Why? Because the Democratic Party had more coalitions than it used to have, and some of those coalitions were quite conservative. Same with the Republican Party. It used to have more coalitions, and some of those coalitions were more moderate. And now what's happened is we've destroyed those coalitions in the parties and replaced it with kind of an ideological and in some cases a temperamental straitjacket that you have to be all in with everything or you're all out. And we saw that we see that all the time when anyone breaks ranks and votes for a piece of legislation that they might support. Well, how dare you do that? How dare you? And the argument isn't even necessarily often about the merit of the actual legislation. It's much more about how dare you be disloyal. But when our country was functioning, when our politics were functioning better, we had greater tolerance for disagreement within parties. Well, that's gone. So what we might need now is a greater number of parties.
Again, since I'm the old guy around the table here, I can remember in 1964 as a young child going with my father because he was involved in politics, and you had a debate taking place between Nelson Rockefeller and Barry Goldwater. Now, that's a pretty wide spectrum if you think about that in the Republican Party. But even more recently, Rudy Giuliani hardly could be considered pro-life, and you've got all sorts of things within the Republican Party, which, and in some cases, even as recently as the 1990s, was still being called kind of a big tent party. Now, to be fair, on the Democratic side, you had Lloyd Benson, you had Sam Nunn, and some of the others. But what's the last time you had anybody that would be considered pro-life speaking at a Democratic convention? Well, I think that'd be Governor Casey would be the last time you had anybody like that. So the Democratic Party kind of narrowed first, then the Republican Party. But when you don't have to make this binary choice, it would bring us back to building coalitions. And as somebody that's traveled to Israel for a few times, we can see that sometimes building a coalition isn't an easy thing to do, but it does kind of eliminate some of the stridency that we see in the political realm right now, don't you think?
Oh, well, it does. It creates an incentive to compromise, which, by the way, helps govern the country because there's a requirement, for example, and there's a necessity of doing things like budgeting, for example. There's a necessity of enacting laws in response to changing circumstances. I mean, think of the dysfunction around our immigration debate, for example, where essentially you've had there are immigration compromises that the majority of Americans have supported for a long time, but they're just impossible to enact because a minority of Americans who are most engaged on the issue block anything. They block any compromise. And you could go through multiple issues where those kinds of dynamics are in play. And so one of the things that a coalitional kind of government does is it requires a degree of compromise. In fact, you go back to the founders. The founders wanted the legislature to be a home of negotiation and compromise. They, in fact, and I don't like the phrase co-equal branches of government because constitutionally the legislature really is supreme. It's supposed to be supreme. It can fire the president. It can fire the members of, the justices of the Supreme Court. But right now our legislature is the least important branch. Mm-hmm. The presidency is the most important branch, and that's not the way it was designed. And one of the reasons why the legislature is so dysfunctional is because it has lost that ability almost entirely to reach any kind of compromise, meaningful compromise. And it's rare as the hills when it does. And so that inhibits the ability to govern our nation. And so we then turn to a system where we elect a new president, and every 4 years you can have big changes in regulations and executive orders that kind of lurch you one way or that way, whereas if Congress can pass laws, it introduces some stability. There's so many reasons why a degree of compromise is something that's absolutely critical to a democracy like ours, and we've just gutted our ability to do that, and coalitional politics can help restore it.
One other aspect I thought I'd just take on just before we take another break is just the fact that you're a constitutional lawyer. And when you have the ideas for this particular party, one of those is classically liberal. Now, if you read my commentary on social media, you read my one on critical race theory, as much as I may express some real concerns about the way in which these monopolistic groups in Silicon Valley can dominate that, we should be, I think, the champions of liberalism. I've heard you speak at the National Religious Broadcasters about that with social media, and you start your piece expressing your concern about that in terms of, I think, the blunt force attempt to deal with critical race theory. We should not, I think, as Christians and as conservatives, be against this. We should not be calling for censorship. We should be allowing as many different ideas to be expressed in the area of debate and let the best ideas win.
Right. I mean, the old saying when it comes to free speech is the cure to bad speech is better speech.
Yes.
And that constitutionally, what we should be trying to do under the First Amendment is, as much as possible, preserve a marketplace of ideas, and that suppression of speech is a very bad idea for many reasons, including the fact that censorship often there's a principled reason, in that even going back to near our founders, and unfortunately, our nation didn't always live up to this, but the First Amendment was seen as an essential hallmark, and the right of free speech an essential hallmark of a free society, just as a matter of principle. But pragmatically, what we find and have found again and again and again is attempts at censorship just constantly backfire. They just constant, and
Yes.
yet we are still tempted to do it all of the time. So you end up violating some of these fundamental principles of American democracy, and then having it blow up in your face anyway is the way that censorship often works. And so, one of the things I think is absolutely critical for any kind of third-party movement is to double down on America's fundamental liberties.
Very good. When we come back, I wanted to get a few comments from David French. We had oral arguments today. Of course, we'll be talking about this next hour on the issue of abortion. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View
your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with David French. He is a senior editor at the Dispatch. Let me just mention again, we've given you a little bit of the summary of his material, and when everyone is right, that everyone is wrong, or yet another reason why a third party might save American politics, came out last month, and we have that there. I would encourage you to go to the Dispatch. You might want to get a subscription. Matter of fact, one of their articles today, what to expect if you're expecting SCOTUS, that is the Supreme Court of the United States, to overturn Roe versus Wade. Also on our piece have posted a piece by the editors of the Wall Street Journal and Abortion Crossroads at the Supreme Court. I've got a commentary coming out tomorrow. But what about this? The oral arguments have been taking place as people have already been paying attention to it. But the conventional wisdom has always been that overturning Roe versus Wade would cause a massive social upheaval and damage the court's legitimacy. I quoted yesterday from Kerry saying, no, actually, it might bolster it because this has been something that has never been easy to justify from a constitutional perspective. And so what are your thoughts about this particular case from Mississippi, whether that could alter in any way Roe versus Wade or possibly even overturn it?
Yeah, I was very curious to listen to almost 2 hours of oral argument today. Listened to every second of it. And after I've listened, I think it's very possible, maybe even probable, that the court will overturn Roe entirely. When the court first accepted the case for review, I was skeptical that might happen. As somebody who's been in the pro-life world, since college in the 1980s, there have been quite a few disappointments over the last 40 or so years.
Yes.
Almost 50 years. And so you don't ever say, okay, this is the time. But 5 justices of the 9 seemed pretty open to the idea of overturning. 3 or 4 of them seemed to be very, very open to the idea of overturning Roe and questioning Roe itself. It's so hard to draw anything definitive from oral argument, but I am cautiously optimistic that there are at least 5 votes to overturn Roe. Now, that's not to say that Roe is done by any stretch of the imagination. There might be a move for a compromise on the court because the court may not want to overturn such a consequential precedent, 5-4. We'll see. We'll see in the next few months. But let's just say that as a long-time pro-life activist and attorney, I ended that oral argument cautiously optimistic.
Yes, and again, back in 1992, again, since some of us remember that, you had Planned Parenthood versus Casey. I've argued that if Judge Robert Bork were on the court, maybe that would have been the case. But just from a constitutional point of view, going back to your constitutional expertise, we're talking about something that is really nowhere in the document, and
right.
As a result, is created out of whole cloth. But for the people out there that are convinced that this is a disaster, first of all, I point to the state from which I'm broadcasting right now, because we still, in a kind of a quirky law, which I know you don't like and we're not thrilled about either, but nevertheless, through this particular law that we have right now, more and more individuals that were abortion-minded women are going to these pregnancy resource centers in this country. Matter of fact, overloading a few that I'm aware of just in the general area where I live, and others are trying to leave the state. So even if Roe versus Wade were overturned, it simply removes that nationally, but then it returns it back to the states, doesn't it?
Right, it does. So, and a lot of people don't understand that. A lot of people think that Roe, if you overturn Roe, you outlaw abortion, or that Roe. So the basic reality is, if Roe is overturned, it goes back to the states or potentially to the federal government, Congress. In other words, maybe regulating it to some extent. And what would end up happening is your state law, wherever you are, your state law would start to control. And the best available estimates right now is that means there would be roughly 10% fewer abortions in the U.S. if Roe versus Wade is overturned, which is a lot of people, a lot of babies saved, but not nearly as much as people might imagine. So in a lot of ways, the work of the pro-life movement would really have to redouble at that point, because then you're going to have to convince your state legislature to protect life. You're going to have to really win over the culture more to protect life. But a lot of progress has been made in that, even under the Roe regime. Right now, the abortion rate is lower than it was when Roe was decided. So that's been one of the hidden successes, and too few people know this, but it's one of the hidden successes of the pro-life movement, is that for the abortion rate is lower than it was when Roe was decided. And when Roe was decided, abortion was illegal or tightly restricted in most places. So, and I do think actually that's one of the reasons why the Roe precedent is so vulnerable now. I think, honestly, a lot of the political will to go to the mat to defend Roe is gone, is draining away. And in fact, in the Virginia gubernatorial race that just happened, the Democratic governor candidate, Terry McAuliffe, spent a pile of money trying to argue to elect him to save Roe. And the interesting thing is, or to save abortion rights in Virginia, and the interesting thing is that only about 8% of Virginia voters went to the polls believing that abortion was the primary reason to vote. And of that 8%, most were pro-life. So about 58 or 59% were pro-life. And so it really is the case that that the sort of salience of defending abortion rights has begun to slip away from the American left, by and large. And so there might be a window to overrule Roe without causing the kind of political upheaval that a lot of people feared. But, time will tell. I mean, we shall see. It's hardly decided one way or the other, and we won't know the decision until the decision is out.
Sure, but if nothing else, add also technology. I remember the number of times, even in the 1980s and 90s, we talked about ultrasound and all sorts of other things, sonograms, not to mention the fact that we have, I think it's about 3 times as many pregnancy resource centers as we have abortion clinics, and just so many other things that did not exist before 1973 in Roe versus Wade. So, again, if you'd like to get some more information about the kinds of things that not only David French are writing about, but other people at the Dispatch, we've got that link there. And David, appreciate the great writing that you do, and I appreciate you giving us another hour today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Let's open up the phones. I suspect some of you would like to make some comments. First of all, I've got some other issues to address next hour, but I did want to give you some time to express your opinion. First of all, we'll put on the table, what about this idea of a third party? Now, we've seen that in the past, oftentimes third parties haven't been real helpful because you had, John Anderson, Ross Perot, Ralph Nader. Sometimes what it tends to do is make one of the dominant parties electable. But if you had a really viable third party, would you be in favor of that? Do you feel that sometimes you don't find a home in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and maybe you voted third party anyway or write in a candidate? So I want to get your comments, first of all, on the whole issue of a third party. The second thing is when we come back, I want to go into a little more detail in this whole issue of abortion. And do you think it is time for the Supreme Court to overrule Roe versus Wade? And I think that is at least a possibility. We've posted this very good article, which I'll read in just a minute, from the editors of the Wall Street Journal. Now, they tend to be not as pro-life as you would like, but then I've got another one here by John Stonestreet, who, of course, is pro-life. And, of course, yesterday I read from Carrie Severino, and I might even read from my commentary, which will be out tomorrow, on the issue of abortion from a pro-life point of view. So I'd love to get your thoughts. So if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back, take some phone calls, and get into these issues right after these messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Talked about the idea of a third party. We've talked about this issue of abortion and the oral arguments before the Supreme Court. Let me just mention again, since I did mention it last hour, but I know people tune in and tune out. We do want to thank those of you listening today from Las Vegas, Nevada, a new station, KKVV, 1060 AM. It covers Las Vegas, and so anybody listening to radio in Las Vegas can hear the program now for the first time. And of course, on Monday, we also welcome to the microphone Daytona Beach, Florida, WMFJ 1040 AM. So 2 new stations this week here on Point of View. And again, we had in the first hour, in case you just happen to be joining us, David French talking about this idea of maybe one possible solution to some of the polarization in America, not the only one, would be a third party. So we wanted to at least put that on the table. And of course, I know a good number of you would probably want to talk about the issue of abortion. So let's head out to the phones. And I might just mention, we have posted this article on abortion crossroads at the Supreme Court. And my commentary tomorrow is pointing out that this law coming out of Mississippi, actually, if compared to what is taking place right now in Europe, would not be seen as extreme at all. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But let's head to South Carolina first. And Paul, thank you for joining us here on Point of View. I think you want to talk about both issues, so you have the floor.
Thank you, Kerby. Enjoy your program immensely.
Thank you.
I moved here from Illinois, and I was in a northern suburb and working as one of those wonderful volunteers on the Republican Party. And slowly but surely, I just continued to see my efforts just do nothing. So as far as a third party, given that where the Republican Party is now, I've moved away from calling myself a Republican, and I call myself more of an independent, sometimes even a constitutional conservative.
Good idea.
I could never.
Yeah.
I could never go back to. I worked at one time for a Democrat candidate when the Democrat Party was more from President Kennedy's era. Now it is morphed into some socialistic nightmare for America.
It is certainly not the same Democratic Party. And you think of, I just mentioned some of those names earlier, Sam Nunn or Lloyd Benson, or you can go down a very long list of individuals. Then, of course, would it be possible for John F. Kennedy to be elected in the Democratic Party today? No. I'm not even sure it would be possible for Bill Clinton to be elected in the Democratic Party today. So that shows you how much has changed. But certainly, that's the third party. I think you wanted to make a comment about the oral arguments before the Supreme Court, so you have the floor again.
Yes. I was just a late teenager, early 20s when Roe was passed. I didn't really think about it too much, and I probably was not a believer in pro-life. Given all the information, the scientific evidence now of when life begins in the womb, I cannot see how people still continue to think that there's not life there. They call it a fetus. And I certainly hope that in some way or fashion that they strike it down from the federal level and put it back to the states. And as you said in an earlier segment with the constitutional lawyer, that Planned Parenthood would have a mountain of work to do to try to move these state legislatures then.
Well, again, another very important point, and I might just mention for those of you that are not familiar, we do have a booklet. Of course, we have a booklet on almost everything on the subject of abortion. And when you come back to the Supreme Court, that was a decision to not decide. Probably one of the key sentences in the case, Roe versus Wade, 1973, and we have that documented so you can use it if you want to talk to people, especially if the decision comes down in that regard. The Supreme Court said we need not resolve the difficult question with life begins, because they then go on to explain, well, we have a little bit of ambiguity in terms of medicine, philosophy, theology, and the rest. First of all, I've pointed out on numerous occasions, we weren't ambiguous. You can pick up almost any medical textbook in 1973 and find they all say life begins at conception. And you can also certainly deal with all sorts of legal principles and precedents and treaties and all sorts of things at the time. So it wasn't very ambiguous then, but as Paul just pointed out, it's even less ambiguous now in light of fetology, in light of the fact that what used to be viability was much later in the second trimester. And now when we're talking about this particular law is going to be very different if indeed it is upheld constitutionally. And as I will point out, let me take another phone call after the break. One of the columns that will be coming out tomorrow, all right, Viewpoints commentaries a week ahead. And I thought that after everybody's talking about abortion, I would have this one surface tomorrow, but I'll give you a preview. There are people that have taken the time to look at the Mississippi law, which would ban or at least limit abortion to anything that happens up till 15 weeks. So you could maybe still get an abortion up to 15 weeks, but after that, no. And if you compare that to the 50 different European countries, you find that, first of all, 8 do not even allow elective abortion at all or prohibit it in very significant ways. So then you're down to 42 that have some limit. But again, 39 of the 42 limit abortion to 15 weeks gestation or earlier. So again, you would have to say that America, and my title of this is America, the Outlier. Right now, America has an abortion law that is much more liberal and much more extreme, much more radical. You use the phrase, whatever you want to do, than what you find. And so the Mississippi law, in some respects, is less restrictive than at least the policies in 47 of those 50 European countries. And so I think it's telling about the fact that when the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, and I'm putting that under quotes, actually said that we will allow abortion really up until at least viability, which at that time was much later than it is now because of the advances of neonatology, it allowed a much more radical philosophy of abortion than what you find in many European states. So anyway, that's kind of a look at what actually is going to be on the commentary tomorrow. And if you don't receive my Viewpoints commentary, let me encourage you to go to the website and see if indeed you could sign up. You can go to the one today. It's talking about the remarkable situation which the president wants to do an investigation of the various gas companies. But if you click on Read Now, the next point says Never Missed a Viewpoint. Sign up here, and so you can receive those in your inbox. And tomorrow, my one will be talking about how this law from Mississippi is no more restrictive than what you find in various European countries. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Gas prices are rising and Americans want action. What can a president do? Well, President Biden has the answer. Instruct the Federal Trade Commission to investigate the actions of the oil industry. The president alleges that gasoline producers are ripping off American consumers and claims that there is mounting evidence of anti-consumer behavior by oil and gas companies. That's a very dramatic claim. Where's the establishment media? Remember this phraseology? President Trump stated, without evidence. At the very least, can't we get at least one media outlet to say something like President Biden said today, without evidence, that oil companies are engaged in illegal activities? There isn't any evidence of this, but that doesn't seem to matter. Energy prices are facing upward pressure for several economic reasons. Some of them have to do with the previous pandemic lockdowns. Others have to do with policies put in place by the president. The economics are simple. Energy demand is outpacing supply. The demand for gas plummeted in the spring of 2020 during the lockdowns. The price of oil took a precipitous nosedive. Once the economy reopened, demand increased. But you can't turn everything around in just a few months. Supply is still not caught up with demand. The most concerning part of this is that President Biden is unleashing federal police powers on energy companies. If previous presidents misused their presidential power in this way, I suspect that such a demand would be greeted by more than a collective yawn from the media and most political pundits. Blaming oil companies is a political distraction that focuses attention away from economic forces that need to be explained and government policies that need to be changed. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I think some of you want to talk about the issue of abortion. And again, Roe versus Wade, 1973. Planned Parenthood versus Casey, 1992. And we may look back on Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization in 2021 as a very significant case. But, of course, we'll have to wait till those decisions are announced probably in June. Let's go back to the phones in South Carolina. Elton, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
God bless you, Mr. Anderson. This is Pastor Morgan of the Church of Obedience, Healing, Restoration, and Deliverance Ministry. And I'm going to be very blunt and fair. We are the headlight regarding the church, not the tail light. We are the salt of the earth. That's what the Bible says. We ought to be the one that set the example. I'm neither a Democrat or a Republican because God is neither. But I am for truth and I am for justice. I think it's a shame and a great embarrassment for this current administration to be in support of abortion and also homosexuality, and especially those who profess to know Jesus Christ who have voted for them, for this administration. That makes them even a more hypocritical than those that are in the White House. To whom much is given, much is required. Now, let me say this, please, sir. I got saved in 1980. I'm a street preacher. I go around preaching the gospel, nursing homes, hospitals, and so forth, as God sees fit to use me to exercise my faith. And one thing I do know, that the greatest gift that God has given us is LIFE.
Life.
And
That's
nobody,
right.
I don't care if they sit in the Supreme Court, the highest court of the land, nobody has the right to take life. Nobody has the right to encourage a woman to tell her what's in your body belongs to you, and nobody ought to tell you what to do with it. I'm here to say that's wrong. Whenever a baby is conceived, that's not your life. That's another life. Your life is your life. And if you want to commit suicide and take your life, then that's up to you. As far as 7 weeks, 8 weeks, once that baby is conceived, that's life. Only God can give life, and only God should take it.
Very good. Well, appreciate the call. Let's see if we can get a few more. And again, we'll get into some other issues on the subject of abortion. But I think Fred wants to talk about the idea of a third party. So, Fred, you have the floor.
Yes, sir. Your booklets, that's an understatement. You got a lot of booklets for every subject. But the third party, that's a pipe dream.
Probably.
There's always going to be one side against the other. That's in the American psyche. It's my side against your side. Sports teams, OU, Texas. Yeah, Cowboys. That's the guys I was thinking about. Cowboys against the Redskins. It's always one guy against the other. And a third party, you have the minor, players like the Green Party, Libertarians, but nowhere in American history have you had, that I can see, a successful third party. And that's my comment, but I certainly agree with that previous caller of yours.
Yes. And again, I always have said that if you really wanted a viable third party, you've got to build from the bottom up instead of the top down. I had a little bit of hope that something might come from Ross Perot because the Reform Party, as it was called for a while, really attempted to maybe have some other candidates running, and there was a Constitution Party that Howard Phillips put together. But what you need is something that maybe even starts at the grassroots, that is successful in electing maybe somebody to state legislatures, then maybe Congress, maybe the Senate, and eventually you could get to something that looks like the presidency. But when it was always a top-down, when it's John Anderson saying, well, I don't like Jimmy Carter and I don't like Ronald Reagan, so I'm going to run as John Anderson, or it's Ross Perot and I don't, like George Herbert Walker Bush and I don't like Bill Clinton, and so he runs, or something of that nature. All it simply does is kind of split the vote. And there's some people, and again, I know this is up for some debate, but some people that think that Ross Perot made it possible for Bill Clinton to defeat George Bush. And I think you could make a real good case for the fact that Ralph Nader made it possible for George W. Bush to win in Florida over Al Gore. But again, you can't say that for sure. But as Fred points out, I mean, it really is kind of a hypothetical. But I thought I would do it, one, because I have a high respect for Jonah Goldberg and for David French. And second of all, I get the question all the time, what about a third party? Okay, well, we did a program, and you can mark it down. December 1st, 2021, you can hear our conversation about what it would take to get a third party, and that would be the case. Now, let's take a few more calls, and we have time to do that, so we'll head out to New Mexico this time and go to Vern. Vern, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, sir. How are you all doing?
We're good, and I really appreciate you calling in.
Yeah, I was just curious, did the Supreme Court have the authority to enact that in the first place on Roe versus Wade?
And that's a two-part question. First of all, did it have the authority? Well, I would say that, first of all, it didn't have the authority because it wasn't in the Constitution. And that was an argument made by Justice Robert Bork when he hopefully was going to be, I guess I said Judge Robert Bork because he never became a Supreme Court justice, that it's not found in the Constitution. So first of all, it didn't have the right to do it back in 1973. Now, back to the question that's related to that, and that is, well, how did it get implemented? Because we do know situations in which the Supreme Court has ruled and which those who were affected by that rule didn't follow it. And I think I can give you examples on both sides of the aisle. For example, you go back to 1980, there's a case called Stone versus Graham. And that was a case which simply said that you cannot post 10 commandments in a classroom in Kentucky. they ruled that it would be unconstitutional to post the Ten Commandments because, after all, students might read the Ten Commandments, students might believe the Ten Commandments, students might even act on the Ten Commandments. Sounds like a good idea to me. Well, I found out the other day that Ten Commandments is still sitting on the wall. It's been up there ever since they ruled against it. Now, that's kind of one where you smile and say, well, it's a big deal. More significantly, the Supreme Court has ruled in a few cases against the Biden administration, and we've documented those. And on Friday, I might even have Lathan Watts go through the list of various cases that have come down from the Supreme Court that the Biden administration has simply ignored. And so that is certainly another aspect of, well, do they have the authority? And that gets back to one of the famous quotes from one of the previous presidents that said, well, the Supreme Court has acted on it. Now they can come and try to enforce it. The Supreme Court's ability to enforce this comes in large part by the willingness by, in particular, the executive branch to enforce it. There were some, for example, I'll go back to Kentucky for just a minute, that said, well, just because you had a 5-4 decision saying that having only marriage between a man and a woman is unconstitutional, so then states are free now to issue same-sex licenses. There were some individuals that said, I can't in good conscience issue a same-sex license. Most of those after some kind of judgment or action. But again, the Supreme Court rules in large part by hoping that everybody will follow what they come down, because they are issuing an opinion. And if there were enough Americans to disagree with the opinion, and I'm not calling for that because that gets again into nullification, it is again an illustration of what has taken place. And I gave you an example, one from kind of a conservative side, one, or actually many from the Democrat liberal side. And that, I think, is something that needs to be addressed in terms of the fact that these decisions that have come down oftentimes against, for example, in the past, Donald Trump, then the administration went along with them. But now some of these decisions on immigration and other things that have come down against the Biden administration, the Biden administration officials sometimes have been willing to just ignore those. And I think it gets back to the whole issue of legitimacy. If no longer can people actually follow the decisions that come down from the Supreme Court, you really do have anarchy. And so it's something to pay attention to. It's also back to a conversation we've had before about money. Matter of fact, one of my most recent booklets is on money. If all of a sudden people said, I no longer going to take dollars, they're going to use, Bitcoin or cryptocurrency or stuff like that, all of a sudden the full faith and credit of America is based upon the full faith and credit. You could see where that leads as well. So there are just all sorts of issues that are dependent upon us as citizens of obeying the law. And what do you do when you have what essentially becomes almost mass civil disobedience? And we've seen this with the riots, we've seen these with the smash and grab, and we've seen this even now with the administration ignoring some of the decisions coming down from the Supreme Court. Maybe longer answer than you wanted, but I thought I would mention it. When we come back, we've got some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll take those calls right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. While we have a pause, I wanted to bring something else to the microphone, but let me just before I do that mention that tomorrow we've got Paul Gold with us. He's been on the program with us before, as well as Michael Andrews. And then on Friday, we have Dr. Merrill Matthews and Lathan Watson. So we look forward to having you join us every single day here on Point of View. But just before I take some more phone calls, again, if you'd like to call, we've been talking about about everything from abortion to a third party, and I wanted to put one more on the table. Does the phrase pro-choice accurately represent the people promoting abortion? Now, we've had people call in saying, I wish you wouldn't call these people pro-choice because they're pro-abortion. Well, they are. And it is interesting that this very good piece by our friend John Stonestreet is pointing out that that may actually be changing because that's how they are oftentimes describing themselves. Again, he reminds us that the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization bill is called the Gestational Age Act. So it sort of brings us into that issue of, well, what are we dealing with in terms of gestational age, and when could we, if ever, limit what are called abortion rights? And he said the preferred label for most of these people that are promoting abortion is pro-choice. But that's always been a difficulty just from a biological point of view because, as we just heard a minute ago, the preborn baby has a distinct DNA and a separate body. And I've done debates in the past. I mentioned some of those in my booklet on abortion, in which I point out that when you debate an abortionist, and they, in this case, I use the example of an individual says, well, we really don't know when life begins because sperm is alive, eggs are alive, embryos are alive. And I go, well, that's just bad biology because, sperm and egg are what? Haploid, 23 chromosomes. A baby, a full-grown adult, and a baby being gestated in the womb is diploid. That's 46 chromosomes, sometimes 47 with trisomy. And so you were talking about something very different. And so, of course, what you have is the Associated Press and all the major news outlets actually live in a world that's, I think, completely unfair, because they refer to the people that believe in abortion as pro-choice, but then they prefer and actually demand in their manual of style to refer to people who then, if they're pro-choice, why can't we be called pro-life? No, they got to be called anti-abortion, or they've got to be called anti-choice. And so you can see that it's not even necessarily dealt with in a fair way. If one side's pro-choice, the other side should be pro-life, right? And if the other side is pro-abortion, then okay, you could call the other side anti-abortion, but they don't play that game fairly, and we've figured that out for years. But then John Stonestreet goes on to remind us that the rhetoric has really changed from this, because after all, going all the way back to the 1990s, President Bill Clinton talked about abortion being safe, legal, and rare. And although that has been used in the 1990s, he goes on to say that is hardly heard today from people, because what you get instead, and if you've read any of the commentaries by Penna Dexter, you will recognize that she has documented this only so well. But let me go through the short list. You have, for example, what's called the Shout Your Abortion movement, which is an attempt to normalize and even destigmatize abortion into something we celebrate. You have a song by Amanda Palmer that laments that we don't celebrate abortions the way we celebrate babies with parties, cakes, and flowers. I mean, talk about decadent, really disgusting. Then you have, let's go through some of the celebrities. You have the actress Martha Plimpton brag that her first abortion was her best abortion. You have comedians like Louis C.K., should I even mention him anymore? Talk about a guy who's been canceled, but admitted abortion is a little like killing, but then turns it into a joke. You have Michelle Williams advocated for abortion after receiving her Golden Globe. Do you remember that? Uma Thurman did the same in the Washington Post. You have Busy Phillips, don't know who that is, praised abortion in a memoir. Elisa Milano and People magazine talked about abortion and how that was a wonderful choice. And then more recently, Cicely Strong, actually in a comedy sketch on Saturday Night Live that you probably have seen there as well. And which is just horrible, by the way. I mean, I'm always up for jokes, even when they're at the expense of something I hold dear, but that's just bad. But that just shows you can't turn abortion into a comedy, right? I think we figured that out, where she plays Goober the Clown and the whole bit. I mean, okay, let's get on from that. A couple more real quickly. Michelle Wolf said that the abortion made her feel like God. Lena Dunham has said that she wished she had had abortion so that she could promote it. Miley Cyrus announced her collaboration with Planned Parenthood by posting a picture licking a cake that read "Abortion is health care." I think you get the point, but it is just amazing. And then you add to that all the other things that have been taking place for some time, and it's just a great illustration of the fact that when we talk about this issue of abortion, it is simply minimized. Let me just make available for anybody that would like to get a copy my particular booklet on abortion, because this may really surface. And the first section, I spend some time talking about biblical arguments against abortion. And I take you through, of course, key passages like Psalm 139, which are probably the best used, and Psalm 51:5. But, of course, you've got many other examples of that in both Jeremiah, Isaiah, and others that talk about that. Of course, not to mention John the Baptist leaping in the womb when, of course, Elizabeth meets Mary, and you have the two babies in the womb interacting. So you have all of those passages and many more. I won't go through those because we've talked about those before. But a minute ago, I mentioned the fact that you would also have other arguments. You don't necessarily always have to use biblical arguments. If you're talking to a Christian that says, why are we against abortion? Well, you can use biblical arguments. But if you're talking to a non-Christian friend, neighbor, coworker, family member, they might say, well, I don't believe the Bible. So do you have any other arguments? Yes, we do. Here's three. First of all, medical arguments. We've just sort of given you the obvious medical arguments because you are talking about something that is genetically distinct, 46 chromosomes instead of 23 chromosomes. The example I used in one of these debates is since I was debating somebody at the University of Arkansas at the time, who was an abortionist across the street, I said, look, you can do a genetic map of a full-grown human being. I even used an NBA center, so something 7 feet tall, and a developing embryo. And the best geneticist at the University of Arkansas Medical School could not tell the difference from the genetic map of a full-grown 7-foot NBA center and a developing embryo. But you could do a genetic map, what's called a karyotype of sperm and egg, and a high school student could tell the difference between 23 chromosomes and 46. So obviously that's the case. But if you use what we now use, and one that is used right now in the state of Texas, a heartbeat, you recognize that once you have a beating heart, I think you're dealing with life, because we say that the cessation heartbeat defines death. Could not the onset of a heartbeat define life? Well, that happens so early that oftentimes women don't even know they're pregnant. Now you are certainly seeing people saying, well, we use a more rigorous criteria, EEG, the cessation of brainwave activity. And again, would it be the onset of brainwave activity that could define life? So lots of medical arguments. I gave you, of course, the legal arguments because the Supreme Court decided not to decide, and yet we've always had as a principle of legal jurisprudence, if you don't know when life begins, if you don't know there's life, you assume that life is there. The burden of proof is on the life taker. The benefit of doubt goes to the life saver. It's called the presumption of innocence, and certainly that is the case. And then the philosophical arguments, I take you through all the attempts that people have tried to use to say, well, it may be a human being, but it's not a person. And I talk about how people have tried to come up with a different definition of personhood. Dr. Francis Crick saying, well, really, we won't consider it a person until it's born and lived a few days. Well, that justifies not only abortion, but infanticide. Others have said, well, until it has a personality or it has a level of intelligence. Well, that's not only a justification for abortion, but infanticide, euthanasia, mercy killing, all the rest. And you can see that these arguments are always in favor of the pro-life advocate. And some of those arguments surfaced a little bit today in the oral arguments, and we'll see how convincing they were to the Supreme Court. But whether they were convincing to some of these justices, they should be convincing to people that are at least honest seekers of truth. And that's what we want to try to do, to equip you to know how to make the case for life and make the case for so many other things we talk about here on Point of View. We come back, I thought I'd wind down today with a piece by Dennis Prager. The left seems to have ruined everything. He's got a long list. We'll do our best to cover it right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, let me just mention as we're winding down today that tomorrow we'll be talking about your work and calling. We'll certainly be talking about as well another book that we'll mention briefly about the influential Christian. But in between, we will certainly see what is the fallout to some of the oral arguments today on the issue of abortion. We'll kind of look ahead to some other topics that we'll be addressing. And of course, on our Friday weekend edition, I have Dr. Merrill Matthews as well as Lathan Watts. Both of them have written very good articles this week, so I'm just waiting till Friday to maybe have them cover that. Also, I know that Lathan Watts and even Kelly Shackelford, who won't be with us, have been following this whole story about Salvation Army, in which they seem like all of a sudden they got rather woke. And is that going to affect their donations? And what about some of the material that they have been spreading around here that might actually be a negative? And again, we've been so supportive of Salvation Army over the years here at Point of View. I want to be careful because oftentimes we've been very critical of stores that would not allow Salvation Army to be in front of their storefronts. And now if indeed they're coming down with things that seem to be promoting the concern about whiteness and critical race theory and the rest, we want to find out what the real story is. And we will do that probably on Friday as well. Let me just mention, though, one of the other articles that we have posted today is by Dennis Prager. He's been with us a couple of times, but this one is called A Brief Guide to Leftist Destruction. And in this particular piece, which goes on for 3 pages, he talks about 16 different venues where the left has destroyed something. Now, we've done this before, in which we've talked about kind of a short list, but if you'll permit me over the next couple of minutes to go through the entire list, it is really devastating. And let me first of all say that when he's talking about the left, he makes a distinction, as we do around this table as well, between the left and liberalism. I mean, liberalism would say you have your right to an opinion even if I disagree with you. The left said, no, your opinion, not only do you not have a right to it, not only are you wrong, but you are evil. And we've been talking about that today with David French. So let's go, and if you want a number 1 to 16, it's a long list. But again, how has the left destroyed certain things? Number 1, art. He says the left long ago conquered the art world. Consequently, since the 20th century, most modern art has been ugly, meaningless, and nihilistic, the opposite of what Western art has always been. Go to an art gallery, you know what I'm talking about. So that's number 1, art. Number 2, music. What the left did to the eyes in art is what it did to the ears in music. Now, Dennis Prager says, as a part-time conductor, I can say with some knowledge that since the invention of atonal music, an oxymoron if there ever was one, most contemporary classical music is also ugly, meaningless, and uninspiring. The people who like such music are almost all music critics and, of course, music professors. Most lovers of classical music never listen to the stuff. So number 1, art. Number 2, music. Number 3, journalism. Journalists were once highly respected. Unless a piece was listed as opinion, people generally believed they were getting, to the best of the journalist's ability, as truthful a report as possible, just the facts. Today, on virtually any controversial issue, they are getting opinion, not truth. The purpose of nearly every newspaper and news outlet is the same purpose Pravda had in the Soviet Union, to transmit the party line. By the way, on these few, we do have a book here on art, music, and art culture, I should say, and media, and those get into some of those in more detail. Number 4, he says, how has the left destroyed another one? Colleges and universities. That should be pretty straightforward. The left has destroyed universities as places of learning devoted to seeking truth and therefore welcoming, even cultivating diverse opinions. Virtually every left-wing idea was born at a university. Then number 5 is not only the universities, but now high schools and elementary schools. Most schools in America, he says, private as much as public, teach children that America is systemically racist and that they are not born male or female, but at a later age will choose whether to be one or the other or neither. And increasingly, American educational institutions deny objective truth exists even in mathematics. Those are the first 5. Number 6. Happiness. You can meet happy and unhappy liberals and happy and unhappy conservatives, but you are unlikely to meet a happy leftist. I agree, by the way. I know some that fit into that category, and they just seem to always have a perpetual scowl on their face. He says the only question is whether the unhappy gravitate to leftism or whether the leftism makes people unhappy. Both are probably true. Number 7, another way in which leftists have destroyed an institution, that would be the family. People on the left increasingly choose not to get married, not to have children, in other words, not to make families. Number 8, women. The rates of depression among young people, especially young women, are higher than ever recorded in American history. One reason is that for half a century, women have been told, as one famous feminist put it, a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. But the fact is, the vast majority of heterosexual women need a man to be fulfilled, just as the vast majority of heterosexual men need a woman to be fulfilled. Number 9, childhood. He says one reason young people on the left don't want children is the left doesn't particularly like children. It's a pretty strong statement. But he goes on to say teachers' unions' adamant refusal to open schools for over a year has opened many Americans' eyes to that fact. So the war on child's innocence, like prematurely talking about sex and having schools introduce them to drag queens from the age of 5. Number 10, This one's sort of controversial as well. Black life. He says, like the Democratic Party historically, the left is racist. And that is so in precisely the way the word was always used. The left believes in black inferiority. And that is why leftists advocate lower standards for blacks. That is why they advocate policies that always result in more blacks dying at the hands of other blacks. And he goes into it in a lot more detail, but you can read it if you would like to. Number 11, black-white relations. That one sort of fits very well, because as soon as you talk about the kind of separations, you would expect that. Number 12 is the military. As the military gets more and more woke, recall the testimony of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testifying before Congress about the need to teach the military about white racism. You wouldn't have believed it. Number 13, late night television. Americans who remember the titans of late night comedy, Johnny Carson, Jay Leno, whatever, remember their sole aim was to bring some smiles and laughter to Americans before they went to sleep. But few people had any inklings of the political views of either host. That is now history. Then he takes a few more. Number 14, Superman. Superman was an iconic American hero. Thanks to the left, he is no more. About a decade ago, Superman stood in front of the United Nations to announce he was renouncing his American citizenship to become a citizen of the world. Number 15, free speech. Never before has the freedom of speech been threatened as it is today, as it has been since the communist revolution in Russia. Everywhere the left has gained power, from Russia in 1917 to the university and social media today, it has suppressed free speech. There's no exception. And number 16, sports. Until last year, sports was a great American unifier. It was the one place Americans could go, leave politics behind, left and right, Democrat and Republican, and root for the same team. No longer. The left has ruined it by radically politicizing baseball, football, and basketball. I left out a few words here, but if you would like to read it, it is a long and daunting list of what Dennis Prager believes are the destruction in America that has come from the left. And that's one of the reasons why we try to uphold some of these values and traditions and biblical principles here on Point of View. And I want to say thank you for those of you that yesterday joined with us in our Giving Tuesday. If you still want to make a gift, you can do so, and we have a particular banner there called Unchanging Truth, and you can join the Truth team. But first of all, I want to thank my engineer sitting in for us again, Doug, as well as for our producer, Steve, and I certainly want to thank David French for giving us an hour yesterday as well. Go to the website, pointofview.net. You're going to find a lot more, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.